Hey, we do. We are. So welcome, everybody. I'd like to welcome all of you to this, which is the fifth session in the rather amazingly 31st year of the workshop in the history of material texts, a seminar that was set into motion by Peter Stollybrath way back in 1993. I'm Jerry Singerman, formerly humanities editor at the University of Pennsylvania Press, and one of the current conveners of the workshop, along with Zach Lesser, the Edward W. Kane Professor of English at Penn, and John Pollock, the Curator for Research Services at the Kislak Center for Special Collections, Rare Books, and Manuscripts, also, of course, here at Penn. We're much aided in all practical and logistical matters by Lila Goldenberg of the Penn History Department and this year's Bristol Schoenberg Fellow in the History of Material Texts. For those of you joining us in the Kislak Center, we ask that you please sign the attendance sheet as it circulates, and that you please also add your email address if you're not already on our listserv and would like to be. One other thing is during the Q&A, if you can be sure to speak more loudly than you think you need to, just so that the people zooming in will be able to hear and participate in our live Q&A. For those of you who are joining us remotely by Zoom, please make sure, of course, to mute yourselves during the talk, but do make yourselves known using the chat function, which Lila will be curating. And during the Q&A, please use the raise hand function so that we may call upon you to hear from you directly.
And Jerry, if I could just add special thanks to our colleague Mia and Fine Arts and the Fine Arts Library and Michael for bringing extra stuff for our display from Fine Arts tonight.
Yeah, and for those of you who are Zooming, you don't see that there's not only a full table of stuff, but a full table of stuff that people here are extremely excited about. So it's my pleasure now to welcome our colleague, Sonal Khullar, the W. Norman Brown Associate Professor of South Asian Studies in the Department of History of Art here at Penn, and a member of the graduate groups in Comparative Literature and Literary Theory and Cinema and Media Studies. Sonal came to Penn in 2020 from the University of Washington, where she was Associate Professor of Art History, Adjunct Professor of Gender, Women, and Sexuality Studies, and affiliated faculty in the programs of South Asian Studies and the Center for Communication, Difference, and Equity. A graduate of Wellesley College, she earned her master's and PhD in the history of art at the University of California, Berkeley. Her work has been supported by the American Council of Learned Societies, the Millard Mice Fund of the College Art Association, the Paul Mellon Center for Studies of British Art, and the National Endowment for the Humanities, to give just a partial list. Her first book, Afflictions, Artistic Practice, National Identity and Modernism in India, 1930 to, I have the date wrong.
1990.
To 1990. Okay, I knew the math was wrong there. Was published by the University of California Press in 2015 and was awarded in 2017 the Bernard S. Cohn Prize of the Association of Asian Studies, honoring outstanding and innovative scholarship across disciplines and countries of specialization. So those awards that are discipline-wide are especially impressive, I think. So quite an honor. Her second monograph, tentatively titled The Art of Dislocation, Conflict and Collaboration in Contemporary Art from South Asia, is forthcoming next year, also from California. Sonal's scholarly profile on the Penn History of Art page identifies her areas of interest as South Asia from the 18th century on, as inflected by anthropology, feminist theory, and postcolonial studies. But it's her work in the history of the book that brings her here today, where Sonal is also the editor of Old Stacks, New Leaves, The Arts of the Book in South Asia, published this past spring by the University of Washington Press. A wide-ranging volume that examines the particular ontologies, histories, and genealogies of the book arts in South Asia from 1100 to the present, Old Stacks, New Leaves also implicitly or explicitly, and I would say fruitfully, essentially, and inevitably, brings those particularities into conversation with the study of books and book history, as practiced by those of us whose comfort zones don't extend anywhere near as far as they should beyond the boundaries of the global north. So please join me now in giving a warm welcome to Sonal, speaking this evening on the topic of wartime gifts, contemporary artist books from Sri Lanka.
No, I don't need a chair. It's all yours.
But you want to be in front of the computer.
Ah, yeah. I do. I see. Okay, that's right.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jerry. That was an incredibly generous introduction. I'd also like to thank John, Zach, and Lila for the invitation to present my research here today, my wonderful colleagues at Kislak and Penn Libraries, John again, Mitch, Jeff, Mia, Michael, Sean, Chris Lippa, the photographer, who I don't think is here tonight. All of you have made a second home for me here at the university. And I'd like to thank all of you who've joined us here in person and by Zoom. Dries Leina, who I have not met, but was someone that Mitch connected me to, has been especially generous with sharing resources on material culture and social history in Sri Lanka, and you'll see some of the fruits of that conversation today. He has my warmest appreciation, as does Caitlin Emanuel, an intellectual interlocutor and the photographer of some of the images that you're going to see today. Sharika Thiranagama's ethnography of the Sri Lankan Civil War, In My Mother's House, begins with a memory of growing up in Jaffna during the 1980s. I recall an art class in school being asked to draw pictures of beaches with coconut trees and farmers tending their fields with cows, images that no longer described our world. At home, I drew pictures instead of being in bunkers surrounded by my family, with speech bubbles of the funny things people said while helicopters hovered. The one-year drawing project and the Incomplete Thombu, artist books commissioned by the independent publisher Raking Leaves, contain other drawings that respond to a 26-year civil war. Created over 2 years and 5 months during the war, the one-year drawing project represents a collaboration between 4 artists, Mohanad Kader, T. Shanathanan, Chandragupta Tenuvara, and Jagat Veerasinghe, from Sri Lanka's minority Tamil-speaking and majority Sinhala-speaking communities who used the postal system to make an assemblage. Created over a two-year period after the war had officially ended, the Incomplete Thombu represents Shanathanan's collaboration with residents of the northern province who shared their stories of home, war, and self with the artist to make an artificial register of property. These books, the focus of my presentation today, tell us about conditions of war and conditions of art in South Asia. Sharmini Pereira, director of Raking Leaves, described Sharmini Pereira, director of Raking Leaves, described her rationale for commissioning the works. Sri Lanka does not have a suitable venue to show the work in its entirety. The book, for this reason, provides a space for viewing the work when gallery spaces do not exist. Oh. I see. You could say the work is being shown each time somebody opens the book. By Pereira's account, the artist's book is an expansive, shape-shifting exhibition space and a material object whose objecthood is constructed and deconstructed with each viewing. In my book manuscript, The Art of Dislocation, from which this presentation is drawn, I treat these artist books as an index of and response to a regional art world in South Asia that has emerged since the late 1990s. With growing collaborations among artists, curators, patrons, and institutions, despite immense conflicts between and within nation states, of which the Sri Lankan Civil War is a prime example. The Art of Dislocation analyzes how hegemonies of artists and institutions in India, the art world centers of Delhi and Mumbai, and an international system of exhibitions are being challenged by alternative modes of production, exhibition, circulation, and distribution for South Asian art, such as those modeled by the One-Year Drawing Project and the Incomplete Thombu. Pereira claims, quote, the Indianization of the region cannot be ignored, but it can also be countered over time as art worlds, markets, artists, scholars, and exhibitions in the region offer accounts that are not India-centric, end quote. To that end, I discuss imperatives for bookmaking in Sri Lanka during and after war, and the aesthetic and political effects of artist books intended for a South Asian, not only Indian audience. The Sri Lankan Civil War formally concluded on May 18, 2009, after 26 years of armed conflict between the government and the Liberation Tigers of Tamil Eelam, the LTTE, a group that demanded an independent Tamil homeland, Eelam, in response to state-sponsored discrimination against the minority Tamil-speaking population. 14 years later, the process of resettlement, reconstruction, and reconciliation remains incomplete. Scholars have theorized post-war conditions as militarization, securitization, everyday occupations, and a continuation of war by other means. Violence and the anticipation of violence, as anthropologist Pradeep Jagannathan puts it, pervade everyday life. In Kingsley Gunathilike's installation, War on Culture, toy soldiers rise from charred books, simulating manuscripts and printed text in Sinhala, Tamil, and English, and engaged in armed conflict on paper surfaces, a reminder of how the Civil War was waged on and through books, libraries, languages, and literatures. Footprints burned into the books recall anachronic representations of the historical Buddha, which you see on the right, and suggest traces of child soldiers deployed by the LTTE in combat. Although this project is not an artist's book, it shows how many Sri Lankan artists have taken up the book form to think through war. I saw Gunathilike's work in an exhibition, War and Peace, Visual Narratives from Contemporary Sri Lanka, in Colombo in 2013. The exhibition, curated by Sujata Migama and Jagat Veerasinghe, was organized around themes of the book, maps and roads, everyday landscapes, the body, the soldier, people, objects of war, everyday objects, and shrines and memorials. As that exhibition revealed, the war was fought, indeed continues to be fought, over history and memory. The Buddhist majoritarian government, led by Mahinda Rajapaksa, banned Tamil memorials to the dead, demolished sites associated with the LTTE, and celebrated Victory Day, May 18th, the day on which LTTE forces surrendered to the Sri Lankan military forces in 2009. This government celebrated Victory Day in ostentatious, chauvinistic, and triumphalist parades. At the same time, state-sponsored monuments to war arose across the country, especially in the Jaffna Peninsula, the imaginative locus for Eelam, where a Buddhist stupa, or reliquary monument, was erected by the Sri Lankan government, and a gilded statue of Mahatma Gandhi by the Indian government. The One-Year Drawing Project and the Incomplete Thombu intervene in this landscape. Of the second project, Shanathanan writes, quote, the book came into existence along with the demolition of all civil memorials associated with the last 30 years of war, the bulldozing and clearing of LTTE memorials and burial grounds, and the mushrooming of military memorials and victory monuments. Right now, therefore, the Incomplete Thombu may be the only remaining material memorial to civilians who bore the burdens of war. End quote. Against the logic of official narratives and grand monuments, the One-Year Drawing Project and the Incomplete Thombu create unfinished archives, interactive counter-memorials, and ephemeral spaces for art and discourse. Available as relatively inexpensive offset printed books, which I purchased on Amazon.com for about $40 each in the United States. And you can see examples of that type here for those of you that are in the room. The one-year drawing project and the Incomplete Thombu also appeared in special editions with distinctive binding and unique drawings by the artists. These books function as art objects, beautiful things that take sculptural and painterly form and are shown in galleries and museums, as you can see from this photograph of an exhibition in Lahore. They also function as ordinary matter and occupy bookshelves and coffee tables, as you see in my photograph of a home in Jaffna. I've seen these books in living rooms and libraries in Sri Lanka and at exhibitions in New Delhi and Lahore. Across these venues, these books suggest the ties that bind South Asians to each other, reciting verses from the Quran or the Gita, consuming junky magazines and pulp fiction at railway stations, studying alphabet charts and anatomical drawings at school, poring over albums and scrapbooks at home. At the inaugural Lahore Biennale, a special edition of the Incomplete Thombu was shown in the exhibition Invitation to Action, along with Pakistani artist Aisha Khalid's name class subject, also published by Raking Leaves. In Khalid's book, unruly drawings, illegible marks, and blank pages defy the lines, margins, and boundaries of a ruled notebook on which one is taught to read and write. This project invokes the trope of the artist as child, a primitive and subversive figure, and comments on pedagogical practice and the production of citizenship in Pakistan. Viewing these artist books alongside each other and with drawings, video, and sculpture, visitors to that exhibition came to see their routines, taking notes, doing homework, obtaining permission slips, applying for travel documents and residence permits, and producing identification papers at security checkpoints as effects of a shared history, as legacies of colonialism, nationalism, civil war, and partition. The Incomplete Thombu and name class subject evoke Kagazi Raj, literally document rule, systems of bureaucratic governance in South Asia whereby Kagaz, a Persian, Hindi, and Urdu word signifying paper, document, manuscript, and printed text, organizes state, society, and subjectivity. In his study of graphic artifacts in contemporary Pakistan, Matthew Hull shows how these systems persist as paper mediates relations among people, things, places, and purposes, despite the prevalence of electronic media and digital platforms. Here, you see a copy of my registration papers at the Capital City Police Office in Lahore, where I first reported as an Indian citizen arriving in Pakistan in 2018. I subsequently reported to a local police station in civil lines where an officer attached this parchi or slip to my papers. At the office of the Surveyor General of Sri Lanka in 2016, I obtained a gate pass to enter a section of the building at which I requested permission to purchase a map of the northern province of which Jaffna is the capital. This is Kagazi Raj in action. 3 pieces of paper, my application, the gate pass, the receipt, to obtain a third, the map that you see here. My experience in Colombo, 7 years after the Civil War had officially concluded, shows how the end of war is elusive. Purchasing maps of southern parts of the island, Galle Town or Colombo, presented no problem in post-war Sri Lanka, where I was understood to be an Indian tourist, by then a common sight, though that was not the case during my first visit to the country in 2003 during the Norwegian brokered ceasefire. With this social and political context in mind, the context of victory monuments in Kagazi Raj, let us turn to the visual logics and material qualities of the artist books with which I began. Between May 2005 and October 2007, Kader, Shanathanan, Thenuvara, and Veerasinghe produced 52 drawings each, one for each week of the year, on A4 size paper with the intention of binding them together. They sent the drawings to each other by registered post. Modeling their work on the surrealist game of acrylic corpse, in which André Breton and friends exchanged drawings and writing in Parisian salons during the 1920s, the Sri Lankan artists responded to each other's work and crafted a book that recalls the parlor games of the 43 group, a modernist association established in Colombo in 1943. Members of the 43 group, like Aubrey Collette, were painters, photographers, illustrators, and bookmakers who gathered at the home of Harry Pyrrhus at 32 Barnes Place, now a private museum and reference library in Colombo, where the work of the painters George Keats and Justin Baranyagala are on display. A copy of Wendt's photo book, Salon of 1950, although I think this is a different edition, which you can see at the Supplemental Foundation in Colombo, is on display in this room in Philadelphia. That photo book, which contains images such as this, is a response to the kind of colonial photographs that you also see in this room by Skeen and Scowen that we have acquired relatively recently at Penn Libraries. Wendt's work is also on view here in this room in a copy of Robert Knox in the Candian Kingdom, an abridged version of the 17th century book by Knox. This edition, this is to say Robert Knox in the Candian Kingdom, published by Oxford University Press in 1948, bears 4 of Wendt's photographs. Okay, so this is a group of artists who are also illustrators and bookmakers. Wendt's projects and those of the 43 group unfolded during and between world wars and independence from British rule in 1948. It is these books and bookmakers that the one-year drawing project cites. As the book's cover informs us, this collaboration, and you can read it right here, this collaboration took more than twice as long as planned because of blockades, shortages, closures, curfews, power cuts, and checkpoints during the war. But of course, they retained the name, the one-year drawing project. By accident and intention, its temporality is interrupted and extended. To draw war is to mark time, standing still, passing slowly, flashing by. It is to see forms metamorphose and mutate, to have enemies become friends and friends become strangers. It is to carry on through fear, uncertainty, boredom, and death. It is to commit to deep play, entering a liminal state in which anything is possible and the surreal is always present, as Margaret Trewick puts it in her study of children's games in wartime Sri Lanka. In the one-year drawing project, identities disassemble, and reassemble as persons become trees and leaves become skin, ghosts become airplanes, and airplanes become corpses. The book yields ingenious, even miraculous conversions of properties and proportions, and shifts between body and country, figure and ground, human and non-human. Veerasinghe's dark, scaly, upright human responds to Shanathanan's sepia-colored, cowering male figure with scars and wounds in the shape of beetles and coffee beans. Thenuvara's branching tree becomes an all-over foliate pattern suggesting body and skin in response to Kader's animate chest rook with fins, scales, feathers, and fur. These correspondences to cite Breton, citing Baudelaire, generate a wondrous play of abstraction and figuration, geometry and organicism, vulnerability and resilience. Inscriptions, some of which are abbreviated signatures, dates and directions, and others enigmatic code, Shanathanan's Indra, for example, emphasize process and potential rather than completion or wholeness. Noting the contingent nature of this work, literary critic Qadri Ismail has viewed the one-year drawing project as an offering, which bears a promise to continue to keep drawing and to wait for the response of the other, to respond in turn if the other responds. By comparison to other media, drawing is preliminary, provisional, and proximate to the body, Walter Benjamin has claimed. It is also relatively inexpensive, accessible, and portable, important considerations for art during and after war. As Pereira notes, drawings of Sri Lanka by Europeans translated land and water into territories, topographies, and nautical routes for exploration and conquest. In his novel, Anil's Ghost, published in 2000 and set during the Sri Lankan Civil War, Michael Ondaatje alludes to this translation. Quote, while the West saw Asian history as a faint horizon where Europe joined the East, Palipana saw his country in fathoms and color, and Europe simply as a landmass at the end of the peninsula of Asia. A blind epigraphist and one-time nationalist who evokes ancient Greek seer Tiresias and Sri Lankan archaeologist Senarath Parabitana, a historical figure, Palipana envisioned the map of the world that reverses colonial hierarchies. I quote again from Ondaatje's novel. Every rock form or cuneiform drawing had to be drawn and redrawn onto the pages of journals, in sand, on blackboards, until it was a part of dreams. The artists of the one-year drawing project are acutely aware of the drawing practices to which Pereira and Ondaatje refer, to the art of cartography and the craft of archaeology. Shanathanan teaches in the Department of Fine Arts at the University of Jaffna and regularly leads university groups on study tours of archaeological sites. Veerasinghe is director of the Postgraduate Institute of Archaeology at the University of Kelaniya. Since the early 2000s, Kader, Thenuvara, and Shanathanan have made art based on maps, GPS systems, and topographical surveys. Their art critically engages historical narratives, such as Robert Knox's An Historical Relation of the Island Ceylon in the East Indies, published in 1681, which inspired Daniel Defoe's Robinson Crusoe. An employee of the British East India Company, Knox was imprisoned by Rajasinghe II, the King of Kandy, in 1659, and eventually escaped Ceylon, returning in 1680 to Britain, where he offered his king and country a first-hand account of captivity in a strange and pagan land. 17th century English, French, and Dutch editions of Knox's book, which you see here, recently acquired by Penn Libraries, thanks to our wonderful curators at the Kidlack Center, contain illustrations of a wild and lush island with cruel, even barbaric customs and manners. Visible in these images of extracting fines and conducting funerals, the work of irrational natives and despotic rulers. Knox's Ceylon abounds in deadly conflicts between humans and non-humans and unusual farming and fishing practices. Such illustrations were at once exoticizing and domesticating, as faraway lands became marvelous possessions, to use Stephen Greenblatt's phrase, objects of desire and new worlds for plunder and conquest by early modern Europeans. The Incomplete Thombu cites other European books that reordered nature and culture in colonial Sri Lanka. Its cover tells us, right here, that the word Thombu or Thwampu in Tamil means a public register of land. Related to the Greek tomos and Latin tome, Thombus were initially written in Tamil and Sinhala on palm leaf and used by Portuguese and Dutch authorities to manage people and property on the island. As Dries Leijne explains, there are different types of Thombus, head Thombus, land Thombus, and school Thombus. This 18th century example on paper is a school Thombu, akin to a parish register. Another 18th century example on paper of a combined head and land Thombu functions as census and cadastre under Dutch rule. Such kagas, paper, document, manuscript, printed text, acquired meanings beyond those intended or ascribed by colonial authorities. In Jaffna, the Thombu came to signify a person's very antecedents, so that the wisecrack, "Don't give me your thumbu," was meant to interrupt someone who was reeling off his personal history, according to the journalist Saman Subramanian. It also signified place, for the identity of a plot of land depended very much on the identities of adjacent plots of land. Shanathanan's record of homes loved and lost shows how the Civil War changed understandings of place, of land, of home, of neighbors. Each of the 80 narratives in the Incomplete Thombu comprises a sketchy ground plan overlaid with a scientific-looking architect's rendering on tracing paper. So you're seeing the architect's rendering here and the drawing on the right. These ground plans and drawings are accompanied by a dry pastel drawing that the artist adds juxtaposed with his text from notes of interviews with residents of the Northern Province between January and July of 2011. Designed to mimic an official government file, such as those used to manage displaced persons during and after war, in and out of officially declared high security zones and resettlement schemes, with handwritten annotations, here, and an upside-down map of the Jaffna Peninsula on the back cover, this book is an artistic rather than authoritative account of war. The artist declares, ground plans, reading from here. Ground plans represent subjective images of properties and houses lost, abandoned, destroyed, or seized. All drawings related to built structures are not drawn to scale and are subject to interpretation. Yet, all characters appearing in this work are based on real persons. Any resemblance to fictitious events is purely coincidental. Unlike tallies of war, in which casualties are represented as statistical data and impersonal facts, this counting book counts losses that this counting book recounts losses that are not or cannot be counted. It measures lives by coffee plants. You see the beans here. Pumpkin patches, cassette players, dictionaries, photo albums, horoscopes, sewing machines, Jersey cows, puppies, and pongo, a harvest festival. It narrates place in the face of displacement. Homes, remembered by Shanathanan's collaborators, are less physical structures than forms of belonging and ways of relating that correspond to the Tamil notion of ur, an everyday word for home. E. Valentine Daniel writes, the ur is not so much a fixed entity with discrete coordinates as a fluid sign with fluid thresholds. And ur, and I'm quoting, or rather I should say paraphrasing Daniel now, and ur is known by its edges, by areas of vulnerability along its frontier, such as the shrines of the sentinel deities, the points at which roads or the village stream enters the village, and the haunted tamarind trees that dot the edge of a village. Many homes in the Incomplete Thombu are denoted by trees, flowers, plants, and animals, suggesting how houses and their inhabitants mix with the soil of the ur and are transformed by each other. Consider narrative 2. My house is in a big farm. When I was small, by accident, I threw a pumpkin seed in our garden, which grew and unexpectedly yielded a harvest. The whole house was filled with pumpkins. The plans that follow emphasize garden spaces over built structures. Garden, 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 mango tree, garden. Shanathan responds to this narrator's memory by drawing a small house in an overgrown pumpkin patch. Twisting vines and creeping leaves extend across the page, filling it with an uncontrolled weed-like energy. This home has no people pictured in it. Other homes are remembered as persons, such as the one in narrative 3. My image of home is the image of my grandmother. She was such a soft-spoken person, like an angel. Her death was a shock to me because it was so sudden. In Shanathanan's drawing, a full-breasted figure holds 2 smaller figures in her arms, between two wings that extend out from her body, that is home. Moving home is a recurring theme in the book. Narrator 67, who was trapped during a battle in the last phase of the Civil War, remembers moving between bunkers and sandbags. You see them here. Bunkers and sandbags made of saris, even silk and bridal saris, because sacks and fertilizer bags were in short supply. For narrator 68, who was evicted from his home, a mono cassette player that belonged to his wife was the only possession they were able to keep and carry through numerous relocations to the Puttalam refugee camp and then back to Jaffna. This narrative has no plans attached. Even narrators with elaborate plans and grand homes, such as this one, articulate belonging through physical sensations and atmospheric conditions. Narrator 66 says, I moved to London in the late 1990s. The bright sun and dripping sweat bring back memories of my Jaffna home. I still keep a handkerchief from Jaffna with me in London. This narrative suggests how events and memories, things and persons, past and present, shape notions of place and personhood. As Maitri Jagathesan has noted in her ethnography of workers on tea plantations in post-war Sri Lanka, or can be deterritorialized and is never complete. The Incomplete Thombu builds on History of Histories, an exhibition Shanathanan curated in 2004 at the Jaffna Public Library, which was burned down in an anti-Tamil pogrom in June 1981 and rebuilt and reopened in 2003. Before 1981, it was one of the largest libraries in Asia and an important repository of Tamil culture and history with 97,000 volumes, including rare and irreplaceable palm leaf manuscripts. When the building reopened in 2003, but was still largely bare, Shanathanan worked with 4 students, S. Kannan, K. Tamalini, K. S. Kumutha, and R. Vasantini, to gather 500 objects from residents of the northern province. Displayed in plastic bottles on red velvet pedestals, these objects included a dead child's shoe, the broken head of a temple icon, various identity cards, passports, death certificates, residential permits, reports of disappearances and letters from missing relatives, keys of houses that had been demolished for the expansion of high security zones, photographs of loved ones lost in the war, the ashes of a burnt house, bits and pieces of plaster, shell fragments, bullets, broken dolls, pieces of dance costume jewelry, barbed wire, and sand. Taking the place of books, and in case you're wondering, I did. There were no books in this exhibition. These objects resembled lifeless laboratory specimens, but were nonetheless quite alive, according to one observer. After the exhibition, they were stuffed into plastic bags and buried, as Shanathanan had not figured out how to return things to people, and nobody returned to claim anything. Gathering objects for this exhibition was as significant as their display. The artist modeled his gathering on the local Hindu Madhi Puchikaran, ritual beggar, who goes from door to door and collects rice in order to organize an offering at the temple as part of his vow. Shanathanan also drew on a Buddhist story in which a mother went to each and every house in the village to get rice and found there is no house where death had not occurred. Such rituals inform History of Histories and the Incomplete Thombu, as Shanathanan collects stories and materials like Amadi Puchikaran and redistributes them. The artist has reflected on his process, the way the Madhi Puchikaran shares his food. In the end, we too share our experiences with others. Thus, the artist's book emerges as and through dan, gift, and evokes Buddhist and Hindu practices of cultivating generosity, charity, and compassion through teaching and almsgiving. In South Asia, gifts often take the form of food, money, clothes, and medicine, and earn merit or enable spiritual purification and transformation. Land, cows, women, and skills are other traditional objects of gift exchange. Gifts build community, for example, establishing bonds between the rich and poor, or between lay people and the Sangha, a Buddhist monastic orders. They mark time, such as the beginning of Vasa, an annual retreat of Buddhist monastics during the rainy season. They create genealogy and locality, or a sense of place, as donative inscriptions at archaeological sites ranging from Sanchi and Amravati to Ajanta and Thanjavur suggests. You're looking here at the gift of ivory carvers. Such uses and meanings are operative in the Incomplete Thombu. Loss spurs cycles of dawn as the artist visits with others, gains insight, and shares knowledge, like Kissa Gautami, the bereaved Buddhist mother who finds that there is no home where death has not occurred. Despite such references to historical and contemporary devotional cultures, the gift of the Incomplete Thombu is secular, intended for a contemporary art world and civil society in Sri Lanka. Natalie Zeman-Davis has argued that the book functioned as bearer of duties and benefits, and was at its best when given in 16th century France, even with the rise of printing and markets. It is this sense of books as gifts, as carriers of relationships like handkerchiefs and monocassette players, that the Incomplete Thombu summons. For Davis's French subjects, as for Shanathanan's Lankan subjects, gifting establishes a context, a circle where and the spirit with which the book should be read and its contents discussed. That's Davis. This context is not a mythic unity or stable system, the Gemeinschaft or community theorized. Am I not going? Oh, dude, is there no way to go back?
Use the back arrow.
Oh, there we go. Sorry about that. Okay. This context is not a mythic unity or a stable system, the Gemeinschaft or community theorized by Max Weber. Instead, it results from an intentional act by the giver, represents an ethical donation and demand, and constructs a social world through its transactional logic. Through its secularized dawn, the Incomplete Thombu proposes an alternative economy to that of the metropolitan art world, even as the book circulates within that world. Here, the artist is curator, collator, collector, and distributor, rather than originator, much less individual genius or hero. The work of art is an unfinished repository and catalyst for dialogue. The artist's book is thing and place, both archive and gallery, and a counterpoint to archive and gallery. Like the one-year drawing project, the Incomplete Thombu refers to historically situated and culturally coded practices of reading, viewing, making, showing, playing, and giving in South Asia. By looking back to those practices, these contemporary artist books look ahead to a future where other stories might be told, new histories written, and war remembered and recorded differently. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was wonderful and rich, and also bringing materials that, of course, to many of us, totally unfamiliar and repays our attention in many, many ways to be discussed. Now, by process of a long tradition, first question goes to Liliana.
I apologize for this tradition. Sonal, thank you so very, very much for this wonderful talk. You were talking about libraries of objects. And then you were talking about the book. And the book has an implicit alternative in your talk, the inscribed harmonies. So I wonder, I don't know nothing about the history of the codex in Sri Lanka. But I'm kind of also surprised at the adoption of an object that is potentially of colonial history as a moment of resistance for that kind of discourse?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. I don't know a whole lot about the codex in Sri Lanka, but I am learning. And colleagues like Drislina, who Mitch connected me to, have been very helpful. I do think I can answer the question that you are asking about these books in particular, without having to relate a longer history of the book. I think that the use of and I do have images, if anyone is interested, of the particular binding and presentation of the Incomplete Thombu is precisely intended to invoke a colonial book and register of the type that's still in use. So the last slide that I ended with from the manuscripts and archives section, where you see a stack of registers, those are contemporary, those are colonial books. That's how the post-colonial state and civil society manage their records. And the red tape that's used as a binding is something that we used for Old Stacks, New Leaves, Codex, published by the University of Washington Press. But we wanted to cite the way that manuscripts continue to be bound. So there is a kind of persistence and power of colonial book production that these books are citing.
Yeah. That's what I
Yeah.
Because it seems so curious that the history of the civil war in Sri Lanka would then be narrated and depicted in however incompletely reports with the object that carries the colonialism. And I wonder whether one is made to reflect the other more clearly in the project.
This is the last bit of one is made to reflect
the other, whether because the images that you've shown, they are contemporary and the present civil war and aftermath. You have shown a little bit of the older books where it's kind of reversed in the view of Sri Lanka. But what I'm interested in is to what extent is there a self-reflection that the current war is depicted in the medium of the colonial previous undertaking. And that is so obvious with the object of the book.
That's true, but one thing that I'm surprised that you haven't commented on, or maybe you've already noticed, which to me is even more striking than the choice of printed book or codex versus, some kind of palm leaf orientation, is the use of English as the language for these books. And it's not just these books, and it's not just a kind of address to, let's say, a metropolitan art world. The choice of English rather than Sinhala or Tamil is significant. Shyam Selvadurais' anthology, Many Roads Through Paradise, took a similar approach with a discussion of why English is the choice of language for a book such as this. And it is not perfect, but it becomes a kind of language through which artists and communities can speak to each other. There's other ways in which English is exclusionary, elitist, exclusionary, colonial. But this is a legacy of colonial rule that is being embraced by both books. And we don't have a copy of A to Z of Conflict, which I did not discuss in the presentation. And that is a relatively recent book produced after the war with many more artists than the one-year drawing project, and published by Raking Leaves, makes a very explicit case for the use of English. And it's a multilingual book. It has pages in Sinhala and Tamil, but English becomes a kind of medium through which certain kinds of conversations can happen. I think that's the best way to put it. I don't think that these projects, and here's where I think these projects are different than projects in music and dance that other scholars have written about. I don't think the goal of these projects is reconciliation. I think the goal of these projects is closer to what I've called memory work, and keeping that kind of open and unfinished, rather than, this is why the Max Weber reference came, but this is not about bringing two communities together. That is not, this is about differentiated experiences of war, even among what I can only presume, because they're not really named, but are mostly Sri Lankan Tamils who are informants and collaborators for the Incomplete Thombu. The one-year drawing project, I think, was intended, I mean, there were all kinds of factors for that book. One is that it was being produced under wartime conditions, and they were thinking about, like, where can you print and bind a book like this? And all of those details are presented to you, in the book. Nothing is concealed about its production. So I imagine that wartime production and printing is a factor for a book like that. I think that book, for the curator, was intended to evoke the kinds of books that the surrealists might have made. And my contribution here is to actually say, there's certainly these Parisian salons that we could use as a reference, but to my mind, this feels a lot like the kinds of books made by the 43 group. And the kinds of collaborations that the 43 group engaged in that have been utterly overlooked. And there's a history of the 43 group were also making codices. Lionel Wentz, 1950, the OUP 1948 edition. These are all codex format books.
I have a question about relation or not relation to the other, perhaps dovetailing on Liliana's, but it's a question about genre. And you have presented the genre of the artist's book as specifically Tamil generated and memorial to
the Thombu, yes.
Okay.
The other project, no.
Okay, so I was wondering whether the artist's book as a genre is politically inflected to one particular side of the conflict or not. And if that's the case, can we think of other examples where an artistic genre is so associated with one side of a society and excluded from the other? I mean, you can't say that portraits are, not painted by all kinds of people, but is the artist's book always in this context politicized?
No, and I feel, these artist books that are commissioned and published by Raking Leaves do have some kind of social and political commitment. A social and political commitment around reorganizing the art world, around thinking about conditions of war. There are many more Raking Leaves books. I gave you an example of the book commissioned Aisha Khalid's Named Class Subject. There's also Bani Abadi's speech. I mean, there's many, many other books that are not about the Sri Lankan context or even about the Civil War per se. I'm going to say to you right now that I struggle with language for all of this because ethnicities, languages, maybe even religious backgrounds are known, in South Asian contexts, but the art world that I feel like I participated in is so secular that we don't name these. But the books that you were seeing, and I feel a little bit uncomfortable even speaking in these terms, but Kingsley Lunathalake is not Tamil. So the use of the book is widespread across communities. The artists who participated in the one-year drawing project, two are Tamil speaking, one from the north and one from the south, two are Sinhala speaking. Okay. And they have very, very different political positions, which is why it's not really a project of friends, but collaborators. And the A to Z conflict book has even more, is a larger, but even more disparate kind of group of authors and collaborators.
Thank you for that. Anne.
Yeah, I just think about the Incomplete Thombu in your wonderful talk. I found myself thinking of the slippage you can have in English of the different thought and different color. In this thing that's like a strange tome of a disaggregated sound. And thinking about the diagrams are fascinating because the thing about a plan that I'm so used to from archaeology, it does not tell you if something stands or not. If all that is left is foundations, or if there's the wall, if this is a destroyed place, or a future place, or a place that still stands. Maybe reading plans is sort of an acquired art too, but how do you move in and out the rooms and who will be in those spaces? I'm interested in what you say about culture things first almost as kind of evacuated language that we can move. And this is more just sort of like an open-ended question for you almost. What do you think at the moment of this sort of springing book of what would you call them? Places stripped of location, but with an extraordinary quiddity. What does it mean to have a book of houses / plants? I don't think this is something that you thought about much, what it means to have those things on the pages and what it means to have.
I think there is that was a wonderful set of comments and provocations. Thank you, Anne. I'm thinking about what you're saying. I think there is a kind of imagined, I hadn't thought about it this way, but there's a kind of imagined geography by bringing, plots and plans together that would not have actually been adjacent or even proximate. So the northern province is quite large. And Jaffna is confusing. The name of the peninsula is Jaffna Peninsula. Jaffna town is the capital of the northern province, and it's also a town, but it's also used Jaffna pretty loosely to kind of refer to a historical region, and it becomes kind of shorthand for the north in many ways when we're talking about the art world and so on. So what I do think is that there is something quite wonderful, artistic, I would say, in imaginative geography and an artistic idea that's bringing all of these together in a way that, for example, a register of property wouldn't. There's something, yes, you're absolutely right, about these homes that we are assuming are lost because they're being remembered. There's a kind of, even while the book is making these lost homes present, they are present as evacuated or absent or in some way destroyed or dismembered. And I think that's an interesting way of presenting property. And that's not really what comes through in reading the book. But at the same time, I think it's really important to remember that while there are all these artistic elements, this is not fiction. And the artist is very clear, and it inhabits a kind of peculiar space about, I'm not reporting fictitious events. In fact, when I was in Jaffna at the public library, in the Manuscripts and Archives division, brought to see a copy of one of these books in their collection, Shanathan introduced me to the librarian who was sitting there and said, "Oh, this is the person who showed us not in any photograph, the person who showed me the palm leaf manuscripts, the medicinal texts. He was one of the narrators. I don't know which one, I don't know which story, but there was something very immediate about that to say, like, this is not Ondaatje's novel. And I think I really like the example that you gave of an archaeological drawing or rendering, which is to say there is something projected, in it, but it also is trying to capture something that's empirically retrievable or accessible.
speak up, please. Yeah.
Sorry. Yeah, thanks so much for talking again. It is, I have like two questions, but they're loosely connected. You mentioned that they are already referring to undergrad, and some of the concepts you showed, like there's a lot of abstraction in the materials, and you said one of the artists argued the objects or the concepts that they were dealing with had to be represented repetitively for many times. So did they talk about Gertrude Stein or Picasso? Three buttons of Gertrude Stein was basically the work where she talked about, I think she was one of the first that she was celebrated for it. Picasso also painted about the Civil War as Civil War and became famous part of that. Were these artists, as they were aware of the group of 43, I think, could they trace it backward and know more about the Western European background of it? Because there is also, because it's ironically, this mode of art comes from Europe, but it was stemming from what these artists, they were inspired by African art, right? African, Latin American arts, and maybe Sri Lanka could be one of them as well. Obviously, Breton knew about it, right? Because dreams, persistence of memory, right? While they're discussing memory is not persistent, right? That's another thing. This concept was in surrealism as well. So were they openly talking about it? Because the Cubism and surrealism, it also served colonized countries' artists to gain their own voice, right? They were trying to bring a different perspective, and basically Cubism is about it, like destructing the old, tenets, modes of Western art, rationalism, and like representation of exact images, and going on with something more abstract, but more true to the subject. And you also said the English language actually is related to that. I'm sorry. Was the English language an instrument that they benefited in a way to learn about? Because Ceylon was very popular for American missionaries. For American missionaries.
What did you say was popular?
Ceylon, Sri Lanka, was one of the destinations that they wrote a lot about. And in the Ottoman context, for example, American missionaries were very instrumental in teaching English. And through teaching English, they brought these ideas, Western ideas, to Ottoman people. Do we see any sort of similar function of people, colonizers coming there, or their missionaries, nothing that colonizers, and helping them learn a language and also spread these ideas?
That's two very different questions.
Those are wonderful ideas in some ways that get to the heart of what I'm trying to do. I think it's I'm not going to say it's very easy, but it's possible to look at these books, and maybe especially the One Year Drawing Project, maybe both the books, and make connections to European art and cultural practices. The citation of Breton is intentional by the curator, and these artists certainly are aware of European art. When I first met Jonathan in 2013 at that War and Peace conference, the exhibition and the conference, he said to me, I have it somewhere in my book manuscript. I think the exact quote is something like, I just couldn't bear to be making beautiful art for the walls in a burning country. And that this art that I'm seeing around me, which is why he turned to these formats, was not doing the work of Delacroix. That was what he said to me about, art's purpose, its efficacy, and so on. These artists are also trained in various places. Khadr's MFA is from the School of the Art Institute in Chicago. Jonathan was trained at the Delhi College of Art. Benuvara has a degree from the Soviet Union, from the Moscow Academy of Fine Arts. And I think Veerasinghe has a US MFA. I'm not sure, but I'd have to double check that. So in other words, I mean, they're very familiar with European or rather Western practices, broadly speaking. What I wanted to do was kind of try to reorient our reading of South Asian art and culture, whether it's modern or contemporary, by way of the usual references. So Qadri Ismail, a critic that I cited, analyzes the books as an offering, but through Derrida's theory of the gift, but without any attention to like, well, what about gifting cultures in South Asia? It's very easy to read some of this work through figures like Pablo Neruda, Leonard Woolf, Julia Margaret Cameron, all of who were actually active in Sri Lanka. I'm not talking about some kind of, distant or imagined relationship. I'm trying to think who the poet is, who wrote one of the catalog essays for Lionel Lunt, American modernist poet. It will come back to me. Wallace Stevens, I think, wrote a catalog essay for Wendt. So these artists were circulating in metropolitan, it's one of the functions of colonialism in metropolitan contexts. But the question of what these books are doing and who they're for in South Asia, I think was very important to me and is very important to the work that I'm doing. The kinds of genealogies that you're tracing, I think are the ones that most curators and critics tend to look to while overlooking some of the connections to, say, the 43 group, or to ivory carvers in Vidisha. And you all know I'm not making a direct connection, but to say that these books will be intelligible, I've seen them be intelligible in South Asian contexts in very different ways than we treat books and manuscripts in libraries.
Sure.
Thank you so much for your great talk. I found myself thinking all the way through the talk about also noticing a lot of tension in the way between the horizontal and the vertical, and thinking about how that implicates largely the field of media. And noticing that, then maybe start to have questions about how, once you introduce the idea of the temple exhibition site, or you start having an artist book that is not a book because it's sculpture, or the artist book gets put in a page that you can't take a picture of, things like the on the wall. So, then I started thinking questions like, how do you stop becoming an exhibition at this moment and become something else like a sculptural piece? And it made me wonder, how does, at a certain moment, this is not an artist book. I think you want to be sculptural. But it made me wonder how the definition of what an artist book is, whether it stays stable, and whether it is made to more in relation to exhibition, as well as to and whether the exhibition how you're thinking about that, and especially how you're thinking about that in relation to war and the body, which would be more
Yeah, well, Kara, thank you. Such a brilliant observation and very, very close to my heart, because this is actually something I've been thinking about over the last week, something like I hadn't thought about fully. And one of the things that I have thought about is, I think what's very interesting about these books is they're moving from art object to everyday object. I've seen that all the time. You can see them in a case or on the wall. They become these sculptural things. Frankly, I love them less in vitrines than I do on living room tables. And one of the reasons is that for me, or in libraries and other places, I think what's very interesting, people have asked me about whether I see the limited edition book and these copies of the book as doing very different kinds of work. I have seen people, so the copy of the book that you saw in the living room is a limited edition version of the book. I actually see a lot of continuity between how that book was used. It was it's kind of opened out. You turn it around, so you're very astute. I showed some slides with different orientations of the book, so you could see that even though it's printed, there's a kind of a spine. There is, because of the way that the text and the images are laid out, the invitation to kind of turn it, and it becomes a kind of board game. I've seen that happen, so that you are kind of playing with the book, and it's not just children's games or adult games. Artists actually work like that. If you've seen them in a studio space or in a salon, and what was happening with the 43 group, you can just kind of imagine the games, which is like, I draw a line, then you draw a line after me, you turn it around. There were a lot of those kinds of exchanges in in that setting that I think these books, especially sometimes with the limited edition where you kind of want to flip them over and just actually see the spine very beautifully. I don't know what that binding is called. Someone in this room will know what that binding is called. But you know, a very exposed, stitched kind of spine that reminds you of files.
It's actually, yeah.
I don't know, but you know, we talked about the question of influence, and you know, do we want to trace influence to Paris or to a Sri Lanka or to Greece? Right? There's another kind of influence that we could look at, which is the influence of the material form itself on the book, which I think can lead to other kinds of cross-cultural connections than did they know Breton, did they know that the artist book in the limited edition, which has that kind of binding, that I was just looking at some of those the other day here in late 19th century European from a lithography gift book. They happen to be gift books. Well, maybe that does connect. Because, you know, once you start to imagine the leaves of a book as artworks, which might go on a wall or might get bound into a book, and are the artist is thinking of the page, is essentially thinking of each side of the page as a work of art. You're not thinking of how to create like a normal way of creating a book where you have multiple pages on one sheet, you fold it all up into a particular format. You're thinking in terms of a leaf at the most, maybe an opening, or maybe just a page as the kind of unit. And therefore, when you are printing them, that's how you're printing them. And so then how do you bind them together? And that technique of these kind of enclosing stubs, right? You see that in a lot of lithographic books, you know, full color artistic books, gift books in Europe as well. There's probably not, I don't know that anyone is looking at those. There's not necessarily an influence there, but I think the formal constraint, the kind of problem that's being engaged is the same, and it's just leading them to the same solution in binding. And so I just propose that as like another way of thinking about these kind of influences, that it's not quite coincidence that these two things happen, nor is it actual lineage, right, or connection in that sense, but there is a connection. It's just a disjunctive connection around the same problem being addressed in two places, two times, the same way.
If I understand you correctly, I absolutely agree. There's no way to write an account of these books without the codex form, without the English language, without European colonialism. So this is not to say that any of those things don't matter. In fact, what I thought you might say, and it came up very briefly in someone's comments, were the impact of missionaries, missionary pamphlets, printing technologies, presses, and so on, and whether that is something. I'm probably the least likely person to be able to kind of weigh in on whether these books, you know, recall that, but I would love to hear if, you know, someone sees a connection that I haven't in all of that. So I think you're absolutely right that there's something about, and I think you're saying it's not just technology, but rather something like format that is inherited by these books. Absolutely, absolutely. And I don't actually have an argument either with someone who would come forward and say Breton and Delacroix and Baudelaire are extremely important to these projects. Absolutely. But what about other kinds of genealogies that we're not paying any attention to, and that I think are extremely significant in the production and reception of these books?
Just to add, you know, if you think of the Conley manuscript codex, it's a sequence of leaves that are
that are joined
very much in the manner of that style of binding, right? Which is not composed. It's not a European book format.
No.
Traditionally, right? Which would have pages put on a sheet folded, right? It's a series. That binding is a series of leaves. Yeah. Basically discrete leaves, then just smushed together, right?
after Marina Rusto's talk, I wrote to her to say that, like, you know, the kind of binding that you were suggesting, you know, these strings, I said, this is like the Pothi form. You know, this is very much like that. And here's Al-Biruni writing about having viewed that form in South Asia. So yes, I think you can also probably tell by my idiosyncratic arrangements where at some level, it's what I was responding to in the book. You can read these books in all kinds of ways. You don't have to read them I mean, these are codex, you know, codices, etc. But you could begin from the back and go to the front. You could turn them, as Karen very rightly pointed out, upside down. To read the map, and Michael Ondaatje has actually written about this, to read the map on the Incomplete Thombu, you have to flip the book around.
Are the leaves written on or printed on recto and verso always? Always. Okay, so even those pieces that migrate to the wall, when they're migrating to the wall, they're hiding one half.
You mean
of
the drawings? Oh,
yeah.
so the drawings for the limited edition books that I've seen, and I've seen two or three versions of them. The drawings were just kind of attached, so they're not rectangular, so it's just one side. And I think intended for collectors to go on the wall and incentive to help fund the project with the limited edition book.
Yes.
Thanks so much, Sonal. Rich talk. Keep important work. I'm so happy to be one of the talk. I have a question, and then I have semi-extension question. One is a clarifying one. I'm curious for history to talk about the role of Japanese students in collecting objects, 500 objects for exhibition, and the burial of the objects. And I'm just curious, what was that process of asking for that done? Why was it maybe that people didn't collect them? Was it simply not a process, method? So the fourth Met exhibition was also part of Limbo Up. So I wonder if part of that apprehension of coming back to and I guess one part I've seen across your entire talk has been interesting is you're engaging with a super rich trove of material culture, but there's also a very specific materialist culture that then that's translating about the world. So you're talking about the art book as eyewitness or memory before. And across a lot of the books, there's all these different relationships, social relationships that are often glossed over, translating or through these universals of war and violence. So, for example, in Dachi's novel, he uses a lot of these universalizing images that are raised with a lot of the specificity within the thing, right? To translate it. So, you know, even certain things like Shanabali's protection of the artwork, not wanting to be protected the artwork, or the story of pulling the inspiration pieces from this image of the backpack. And even with something like Thombu, of course, something that Thombu registers is a land-owning community of people who had deeds to property, which then begs the question of what about those who did not have deeds to property, who are also affected in this narrative. And that's something that maybe, you know, the artist book market themselves is not facing this, but it's something that I've seen registered in going through all these things. So I was wondering if you had thought about that.
Thank you. I'm going to see, because I think these were great provocations. I'm trying to remember the first one was about about the white. Yes. Okay. So that's actually, it's a very complex question, but I have a very simple answer, and I will tell you very honestly where I am. Is that that information is cited from Saman Subramanian's This Divided Island, and he interviewed, the basis of his interview with Shanathanan. The way that Subramanian, who's an Indian journalist writing about the Sri Lankan War, presents it is, and I have not double checked with people who were in Jaffna, the artists or communities who saw their project. But the way that Subramanian presents it is something like it was inauspicious and or these are the kinds of objects that, were too painful to collect. That is the implication. It is not stated in that account, but as a reader, that's what I came away with. I do think that a fact that's presented in that account, which is that these were buried, is also reminiscent of ways in which books have particular kinds of lives and immersion rituals for books at the end of their life. Immersion rituals in South Asia for books that are typically manuscripts. So that people are treating these objects, which are not books, like they are a manuscript at the end of. I mean, there was something to me this is not something Subramanian is interested in, but as I'm reading this, I can't help but think these are not books, but they're books. And even if they are, on one hand, they could be painful and auspicious. On the other hand, you would think about them as books at the end of their life that must be immersed or must have a funeral of some kind. I guess that's how I understood the treatment of books in that project. I think the second part of your comment and question, which is a great one, is about, if I may be very direct about it, it's about elites, it's about male elites, it's about metropolitan elites and their role in narrating the Sri Lankan War. I think Ondaatje's novel, which is not the only one, as you know, about the Civil War, is very useful for my purposes because of its interest in art and archaeology. And some of the other novels, I just read B.V. Ganeshanathan's Brotherless Night, which I loved, but it doesn't have that kind of historical interest. I mean, when I first read Ondaatje's novel, and I've read it many more times, it's also the kind of novel which is like Ganeshanathan's book, but in a different context. You know who these people are, like Ananda, the artist turned miner, named after Kumaraswamy. I mean, they're passages of an art historian, or if you know a little bit about archaeology, you're like, oh, he's referring to that fight, over the Sigriya. I mean, it's just, there's tons of historical figures. So there's a kind of history of art that's contained in that novel that's very interesting for me. And a thinking about drawing. What do artists do when they're making, when they're drawing? So that's why that's a particularly good resource for me. All the criticisms of that novel, which is to say that it is universalizing. There are even accounts of that, or critiques of that novel, which I have taken on in the book about a bias against Tamils, that it presents a kind of Sinhalese centered view of the conflict and so on. So that is very much on my mind. I think with these projects, if you're going to ask whether they're going to contain class or caste-based accounts of the Sri Lankan War, no. I think these are accounts of the war by elites, and not only of elites, because it's quite clear from the Incomplete Thombu that not all of the people who are narrating their stories in that book are land-owning elites. I should also say I don't understand Thombu in that context, which is to say not the historical Thombus. The Incomplete Thombu is not actually about deeds or about property in some way. It's about what a register could be, what a record might look like that would be more inclusive than the ones that we have. So I don't at all see it as, I mean, there are many stories of people who don't have anything, the house with no plan, or the story with no plans attached, and that we need to pay attention to those kinds of stories too. So I don't see the Incomplete Thombu doing the same work, or even attempting to do the same work as the Dutch or Portuguese registers. But is that answering the question that you asked? And the Thombu, if I may, and now I'm just using all of you as the workshop audience that you are, but I think Anne's comment about that this is a book that's making us think about plot and plan very differently. It's Thombu in a kind of an expanded, what might a counting book look like that doesn't count? So it's not inoperative, because I think I wouldn't have used that word, or there are a lot of people who write about, like, this is art, it doesn't have a function. But I think that there is an efficacy to this the memory work piece. So I'm not even saying remembrance, but memory work piece, that there's something that it's doing, not just at the time of its production, but still in terms of creating a space for dialogue that didn't exist during the Rajapaksa years, and maybe still doesn't exist given the rise of various kinds of Buddhist nationalist groups, rising discrimination against Muslims, and other and other concerns in Sri Lanka, like the ongoing economic crisis.
Mitch, you look poised to make a comment. Go ahead.
Please, please,
one.
Mitch.
Yeah.
Actually, on the Thombu question, I'm really interested in your exploration of sort of the South Asian art markets, art circuit reception, and I was thinking of Incomplete Thombu as a really interesting example there, right? I'm not sure that it would be legible anywhere outside Sri Lanka. Thombu was like you could cross over in Tamil Nadu, and I don't know
you wouldn't know.
any
No.
idea what you're talking about.
No.
And I like that idea as like a Sri Lankan centered art project. That sort of resists larger
Indianization.
hegemony,
Yeah.
Or even linguistic. Even Tom was not from Sri Lanka, sort of confused about the larger context of that. And you're talking about galleries in Lahore, but how these artists have presented their work as like essentially way as other things, and how that's received in these circles within something.
Okay, the last bit. So how they presented their work and how it's received?
Yeah, like is there an attempt to sort of have the internalized language of the Thombu while also universalizing this as artist book?
Oh, yeah.
Please pay $1,800 for the extended edition.
So I'm so glad that you asked this question, because in some ways it feels a little bit like I did my job, which is to show you that, to insist that there is a Sri Lankan audience and address and affect an affect of these books that's very particular. At the same time, the book is telling you, I mean, I have come to work on Sri Lanka, but certainly was no expert on it. The book tells you how to read it to some extent. It gives you the clues about what a Thombu means, how you might orient the book, how you might look at it. And then I have learned, and so I will also say, while there is this kind of particular location to these books, they travel. They've been shown, I've seen them in Delhi and Lahore, they've been shown in Brisbane. They have probably traveled, I haven't tracked them down to North American venues, but I think you all understand. I mean, I presented this to you. I don't think it would have been impossible for you to pick up the books and kind of just figure out what their logics are. But I wanted to emphasize in this talk, and now, I mean, I'm really sounding, if not like a nationalist, like a regionalist, but I wanted to suggest to you that some of the connections that an audience such as this might not automatically make with these books, that I think the audience in Lahore understood, even with the vitrine, is that Kagazi Raj connection. Bureaucratic governance. Everyone knows what it's like to produce your identification papers, residence permits, very different during Civil War than not. I narrated the fairly ordinary experiences I had to just show you that this is a system that we all participate in. And so that these books are actually making connections in a South Asia that's deeply divided by ethnicity, by caste, by class, by gender, that these projects are going some way to addressing. Now, if there was a project, we're not there yet, that's a feminist, civilian-centered project. We have novels and poetry, but we don't yet have a book that I could show you. But that's kind of, I think that's Caitlin's question to some extent. And I'm like, yeah, I want that book, but it hasn't been invented yet.
Well, we will wait for you to talk about it next year, we hope. And for this year, just thank you for really a wonderful program. And there is loads on the table to look at.